Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I know it's been a while since we did a learning video. We've been doing a lot of music kind of stuff. I wanted to try to throw some covers off there. I got some things coming up, whatever. Keep it on the slide. Welcome back to another Why It's Important video. So for this episode, we are actually going to be talking about something that's really important, and I'm going to tell you why. What we're going to talk about today is going to be EQ and or equalization. There's a lot that goes into this topic, so I'm going to try to split this up into two parts rather than like I did with gain staging. First part I want to talk about is EQ and like what it is, proper ways of EQ. I want to talk about like frequency spectrums, where a lot of stuff will have like fundamentals, octaves, things like that. And then on the second part, we'll actually dive into that project we were working on last time in gain staging and start applying some EQ so we can actually hear and see the differences that we're making. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw up a chart real quick. If you guys need to, you can go ahead and take a picture of this. I'm gonna be referring to this chart a lot. It's probably going to be easier if you have it pulled up on the side or something. I might try to keep it in the bottom corner. I don't know yet. We'll find out. So if you look along the top and the bottom, you can see something that says HZ, and then you see 20, 40, 60, 100, so on and so forth. And then you start seeing 1K, 2K, 20K. So we're going to break down what that is. So the first thing you're seeing, HZ, actually stands for Hertz. And Hertz is how we measure basically waveforms. If you look at the bottom, you can see two things. You can see something that says sub-bass, bass, mid-range, mid-highs, high frequencies, and then you can also see another thing that says 1/3 octave equalizer bands. So sub-bass, I'm sure you've heard this a lot, especially if you're like a hip-hop producer. Sub-bass is sub-frequencies. It's essentially something that you will not hear in a full range speaker, although in here they kind of boosted it up around probably about 60 hertz is where sub bass is. I generally tend to make sub bass more of something that you feel rather than something you hear. That's why if you watch a lot of like music production tutorials and they start talking about 808 kicks, and then you know how sometimes you'll see them and they play the MIDI but you don't hear it, like maybe if you're on your phone or a pair of headphones, it's because the frequency is too low to be replicated by your speakers. Most times you do need a sub, or you need a speaker that's at least, I want to say, maybe a 7-inch cone driver or bigger to get those kind of frequencies. Next up is going to be bass. Same thing, it's sub bass but higher, it's just a frequency range. Mid-range. Now keep in mind, mid-range is also split because you have mid-range, high mids, and then you also have another category known as low mids. They might have been calling bass the low mids. It depends on your It depends on your interpretation of it, but there is usually a category known as low mids, then mid-range or mids, and then high mids. And next is high mids, of course, and the next is high frequencies. High frequencies are usually those frequencies that I like to call it the excitement factor, but we'll get into that later. When we're looking at this, so you can see what is known as chest or thump, and then rumble. I don't really agree with the placement of chest thump. I agree with the placement of rumble. So basically, as I tell everyone, if you have any frequency that's around, I want to say 40 hertz for most people or less, it's a frequency that you don't exactly hear, but it's a frequency that you feel. If you have an oscillator, you can always try this. If you have an oscillator and a sub, of course, you can try running any frequency from 40 hertz or below and just turn on a sub and just boost the volume, and then you'll start to understand where you get that rumble from, because it's mostly the vibration of your speaker against whatever surface it's on, and you can feel it more. It's the thing that kind of makes your body go ooh, ooh, like that, instead of like something that you'd be like, oh yeah, that's 30 hertz, that's 25. It's at that point it's kind of indistinguishable unless you're just the ears of God or something. All right, next thing, you got this right here, which is called AC or ground. What does that mean? Basically, there is a thing in audio engineering, and this has to relate to power issues. A lot of people don't like to think about this side of studio production, but if you actually have power issues because say you're running into your wall outlet, or say that you have an ungrounded outlet, or say one of your hot cold switches are switched around, this can create what is known as AC or ground hum. And normally AC ground hum is a low rumble that you hear around 60 hertz, and it's something that you can't take out unless you address your power situation first. It's very common, especially when people start home recording or they build a studio from scratch, that they'll just plug straight into their wall outlet AC. And a lot of people don't know that actually the power that comes from your outlets is not regulated voltage. So if you actually look here, this is my voltage regulator. It's a Monster Power Pro 2500. So the voltage you want to have is going to be about 120, but as you can see on my voltage meter, it's reading at about 121 at the moment. And sometimes, usually, if you introduce something to the power circuit, like say someone in your house turns on a light, turns on a vacuum, runs a washer or dryer, that will actually either spike your voltage up, or it will lower it above or below the 120, and that can create the ground hum that you're looking for. Or it could also do spikes to your audio equipment, and sometimes it can damage it. It's just something to keep in mind. Bottom, I like to explain it more as like if you have a bass guitar, it's more of that pleasing low end that you kind of feel. It's like the low end that blends with your kick drum, if that makes sense. I think it's the only way I can explain it. The next thing up is going to be the boom or the punch. Now for boom punch, this relates a lot to drums. And so normally if you're doing anything with toms, kick drums, sometimes snares, it's a little iffy on this section, but definitely more of the toms and the kick drum section. Boosting around the 100 to like 130 range is going to give you a lot of what is known as the punch factor. If you go anything below that, you're usually picking up low-end rumble. Of course, kick drums, it's different. And if you're doing anywhere above that, especially on toms, you're usually boosting the fundamental, which is something we'll get into later. Next thing up is going to be known as warmth. I call the warmth section somewhere between 180 to about maybe 250-ish. It depends on the instrument. Of course, for guitar, this is kind of where you get the fullness of a guitar from. For snare drums, this is where you get the bottom. For bass, this is where you get a lot of really built up sub frequencies, especially around the 125 range, which is outside warmth. I should address that later, but now you know. Let's move on to the next thing. I'm gonna skip the fullness mud area because that's a really tricky subject, because on one end fullness is a good verb, on the other end mud is a bad verb, and once again it just depends on which instrument you have, and we'll get into that section later. The next thing we're going to talk about is the honk. That is going to be your 500s to about 800 range. I'd agree with that. For me, I think 500s is mostly going to apply for drums if we're talking metal context. Drums, I tend to boost bass sometimes around the 600 to 700 range because it actually has a nice pleasing kind of throaty sound there that makes it sound thicker. On guitar, I like to cut at around 750, which is in the honk area, and sometimes with voices, you want to cut a little bit higher, sometimes around that 1K to 850, you want to sweep around there. Whack, I have no idea what that means. I assume that has to deal with drums. I don't know. I'm going to talk about is crunch. Actually, no, let's talk about tin. So tin is like the, so if you basically have like a tin can and you like ding, that kind of weird tinny sound, that's what they're talking about there. That is where I would say your vocals are for tinniness. If you try to boost it, it makes it sound like it's kind of coming through that radio transmitter kind of thing. Not to the effect of a band pass, but more to the effect of like, if you have a really muddy mix, and you need your voice to kind of stand out, sometimes boosting in that 10 section can actually help your voice cut through a mix. Of course, it depends on the type of voice and if their voice is pleasing or better suited for that frequency range. Next thing up we're going to talk about is crunch. Crunch, I want to say this is probably where you're getting a lot of your distortion elements for guitar to come in. Of course, they could be talking about a myriad of different things, but for me, I best relate it to where guitar distortion comes in. Typically, you want to try and dip a little in the crunch section on guitars because it will give way for, like I said, vocals, and it will also give way for solos. If you ever have yourself fighting with your rhythm guitars and your solos, dipping between that 2 to 3K range is a great way to have your solos boost up and have your guitars come back down. Now, edge is kind of a tricky thing because edge can depend on your hearing in itself. Most people are very sensitive to a 4K tone. 4K is very displeasing to the ear, and the tone, the more fundamental one, would be 2K. That's probably even more displeasing to the ear. It's not a very pleasing kind of sound. However, for guitars, depending on how you want to be, in the 80s, that was where a lot of people like to boost, which gave it that very metal zone characteristic. I could see definition working if you're talking about, say, drums. So around maybe this 5 to maybe 8K is where you're going to start hearing the sounds of like stick click, beaters against heads. That's where you get a lot of the attack definition for drums, is around that frequency range. As far as sibilance goes, that's when you're getting a lot of that that kind of stuff with vocals. You're getting a lot of the S's, the P's, the B's, the pops, all that kind of stuff is in that sibilance range. That's also where you get a lot of diction, if you've ever heard that if you're a singer. I would typically make air a little bit lower. I say anything that's 10K or above is known as air. It can also be known as what I said before, which is that excitement factor. Usually if you have, say, very dull vocals, boosting in that 10K range, sometimes even higher, 12K, gives a little bit of excitement to the ear. That's also what a lot of people do with mastering and sometimes mixing, is if you want your mix to sound a little more exciting, they tend to boost the high end, because most compressors and or limiters that you use, depending on which limiter, will actually compress harder on your high end. Moving up, we're now getting into frequency ranges commonly associated with instruments. Since we are a metal channel and we focus on a lot of metal, I'm going to pick out the most metal things here and explain those. So let's start with the kick drum. So as you can see in the kick drum, you're getting anywhere from the about 50 hertz going all the way up to about 7 or 8K. I think this is subjective because, once again, I have had mixes where you can have a very muddy kick with your low frequencies, and most people when they're mixing, they tend to high pass their kicks at about 40 to 45 hertz, and of course you can do it lower depending on how active the kick drum is. If you're doing more active kick patterns, you want to high pass higher. If you're doing less active kick drums, you want more boom, high pass it lower. Simple. Snares, we are going about 80 hertz all the way up to about the 7 to 8K range. I'd say that's pretty accurate. Most times I high pass my snare at about 100, maybe 120. I do some boosting around the 250-ish range. Do a lot of cutting at 500, and then once again boosting at the top end to get a lot of that stick attack. Toms, this is a little subjective as well, because you can also factor in bass toms, which are basically mounted kick drums, but you can go all the way up to I believe I've seen like piccolo toms, which are like 4-inch toms. I've seen roto toms, which are pretty high. You have bass toms, which are pretty low. So it's subjective, but that is a general range. This is a little iffy because with this bass, they're talking more orchestral bass. or a double bass. They're not talking about like electric bass. Of course, electric bass has a very wide range because you can get 5 strings, you can tune down, you can tune up, you can get a 6 string. So subjective, once again, can't tell you. Guitar, same thing, you could tune down, you could tune up, but with guitar, it's hard to tell, man. The thing about guitars is that guitars are usually with metal, they're distorted. And when you have a distorted instrument, they're highly compressed. And with guitars, they take up a very huge frequency range. The guitars are probably the most difficult things to EQ in a metal mix because of how much frequency they take up. Now, typically you can try to minimize as much as you can. Normally for me with guitars, I try to cut off at around the 9K range, because anything above that is just hiss and fizzle from the high gain amp, and you don't really need that. And I usually low pass the 120, 140 range, somewhere around there, because at that point you're cutting into your bass frequencies. And if you want to have really heavy guitars, honestly, you need to turn up that bass player, guys. I know he seems useless, but he's what makes you sound
big.
Vocals, very, very hard to throw into a range, because vocals can go anywhere. You can have those Luther Vandross vocals. You can have those, Kellen Quinn, is that his name? The one who sounds like once you have a singer and maybe you are the singer, what I tend to do is, if you want to mess around with the EQs, record talking, record whispering, record shouting, record singing, and then just go in with an equalizer and just sweep through, find what you like, find what you don't like, cut, boost, whatever you think is going to help you determine or get that sound that you want. That is typically how you address vocals. There are a couple of shortcuts and steadfast ways, because male voices tend to act one way, female voices tend to act another way, but each voice is always unique. That's always going to change, and there's nothing you can do about it. I am going to go ahead and work on the second part, where we actually go into the mix and we make some moves, see how we can make things fit in the context of a mix. But hopefully this video was extremely helpful to you. I will try to leave a link to this photo that I found, so that way you can pull it up at any time in the description. And if you ever need help with EQ referencing, or if you have any questions, say like something's not working in a mix for you, or you're having mud issues, high-end issues, go ahead and comment down below, and I will try to give my best answer, help to you, to help you figure out what's going on. Until then, I will see you guys next week when we go into the mix to do wizard stuff with our EQ powers and spread good music. Bye.